The chandelier sparkled above the dinner table, casting dancing shadows across the faces of 12 guests. They were all important people, the kind who owned companies, sailed yachts, and had their photos in business magazines. And at the head of the table sat Richard, adjusting his gold watch for the third time that evening. His wife, Natalie, sat quietly beside him. Her fingers traced the edge of her plate, finding the fork exactly where the housekeeper had placed it. 2 years had passed since the accident that took her sight, but she'd learned to navigate the world in darkness with remarkable grace. Richard, however, hadn't learned to accept it at all. More wine? Richard's voice cut through the dinner conversation, but he wasn't offering it to Natalie. He never did anymore. She heard him pouring for the woman on his other side, someone from his firm whose laugh was too loud and whose perfume made Natalie's head hurt. The dinner conversation flowed around her like water around a stone. Stock, prices, vacation homes in the Hamptons, the new yacht someone had purchased. Natalie remembered when she used to be part of these conversations, back when she could see the faces of the people she was talking to, back when Richard still looked at her with something other than disappointment. You know, Richard's voice suddenly rose above the chatter, and Natalie felt her stomach tighten. She knew that tone. It was the same one he used before closing a ruthless business deal. My wife used to be quite the pianist. The conversation died. Natalie's hand froze on her water glass. Oh, really? Someone asked politely. Yes, indeed. Natalie, dear, why don't you tell our guests about your musical background? She felt every eye in the room turn to her. I studied at the conservatory before we married, she said quietly. She gave it all up for me, Richard continued, and there was something sharp in his voice like broken glass hidden in honey. Hasn't played much since the accident, though. Have you, darling? Natalie's throat felt dry. No, I haven't. Such a shame, Richard said, standing up. She heard his chair scrape against the floor. But you know what? We have that beautiful, grand piano in the living room. Just had it tuned last week. Why don't you play something for our guests? The room went silent. Someone cleared their throat uncomfortably. Richard, I don't think... Natalie started. Nonsense. Our guests would love to hear you play, wouldn't you? He addressed the table, but it wasn't really a question. Richard never really asked questions. He made statements that sounded like questions. I haven't practiced, Natalie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not since you went blind? Richard finished for her, the word hanging in, the air like a slap. Well, music is about feeling, isn't it? You don't need to see to feel. Someone's fork clinked against their plate. The woman with the strong perfume laughed nervously. Richard, perhaps... No, I insist, Richard said, and now Natalie could hear him walking around the table toward her. Come on, darling, don't be shy. Show everyone that you're still capable. That word, capable, it was loaded with meaning. Every day for 2 years, Richard had found little ways to remind her that she wasn't capable anymore. Not capable of being the perfect wife who hosted his parties. Not capable of being the beautiful accessory on his arm at corporate events. Not capable of giving him the perfect life he'd imagined when he'd married her. She felt his hand on her elbow, not gentle but insistent. Come on. What choice did she have? To refuse would mean dealing with his cold anger later, after the guests had gone. At least this humiliation would be public. He'd have to maintain some pretense of civility. She stood up slowly, her hand finding the back of her chair for balance. The walk to the living room felt endless. She heard the guests following, their footsteps reluctant on the marble floor. Someone whispered something she couldn't catch. The living room smelled of leather and Richard's cologne. She heard him opening the piano lid, the sound echoing in the large space. There we are, he said, guiding her to the bench with a hand on her back. The stage is set. Natalie sat down, the bench familiar yet foreign beneath her. Her hands found the edge of the keyboard, and she positioned herself the way she'd been taught so many years ago. Her feet found the pedals. What will you play for us? Richard asked, and she could hear the smirk in his voice. He was enjoying this. He knew she'd fail. He wanted her to fail. I don't know, she admitted. How about something classical? You used to love Chopin, didn't you? Before you decided you couldn't play anymore. She hadn't decided anything. The doctors had said she might never walk again, let alone play piano. She'd proved them wrong about the walking, but the piano, she'd been too afraid to try. What if muscle memory wasn't enough? What if she'd lost the thing she'd loved most in the world? "We're waiting," Richard said, and she heard him step back, probably standing with his arms crossed, that satisfied look on his face that she could picture even in her darkness. Her fingers trembled as they found the keys. Middle C, she remembered where that was. Her piano teacher from childhood had made her find it with her eyes closed 1,000 times. "Music lives in your fingers," she'd said. "Not in your eyes." But that was before. Before the accident. Before the darkness. Before Richard's love had turned to resentment. She pressed a key. The note rang out, clear and true. Then another. And another. Simple notes. Nothing like the complex pieces she used to play. She could hear someone shift uncomfortably. Someone else whispered. Richard cleared his throat impatiently. Her mind went blank. She couldn't remember a single piece, not even "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." Her hands felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy and useless on the keys. "Having trouble, darling?" Richard's voice was silk over steel. "Perhaps you need the sheet music?" "Oh, wait." Someone gasped at his cruelty. Natalie felt tears prick her eyes, but she wouldn't cry. Not here, not in front of them. She placed her hands in position for a C major scale, the first thing any piano student learns. Even that felt foreign. Her right hand started up the scale, C, D, E, F. She missed G, hitting the black key instead. The wrong note rang out like an accusation. "It's okay," someone said kindly. A woman's voice, older, sympathetic. "You don't have to." "Of course she does," Richard interrupted. "Natalie never gives up, do you, darling? That's what you always used to say, never give up." He was throwing her own words back at her. Words from when she'd been learning to walk again, learning to dress herself, learning to exist in a world of darkness. But this was different. This was him showing everyone that she was broken, that he was saddled with damaged goods. Natalie's hands hovered over the keys. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the humiliation and fear, something else stirred. It was small, barely a whisper, but it was there. Anger. For 2 years she'd accepted his subtle cruelties, his sighs of disappointment, his gradual withdrawal of affection. She'd blamed herself for the accident, for not being the wife he'd married anymore. But sitting here, being displayed like a circus act for his amusement, something inside her began to wake up. Her fingers settled on the keys again. This time, she didn't think. She just let them rest there, feeling the cool ivory and ebony beneath her fingertips. And in that moment she heard it. Not with her ears, but with her memory. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. She'd played it at her senior recital the night Richard had first seen her perform. He'd sent roses to her dressing room. The first note was quiet, almost uncertain. But it was the right note. And then the next one came, and the next. Her left hand found the bass notes, those deep, rumbling warnings of the storm to come in the piece. But could she continue? Could she remember what came next? Or would she fail completely, giving Richard exactly what he wanted? The room held its breath, waiting. The notes hung in the air like a question. Natalie's fingers trembled on the keys, but they remembered. They remembered the way this piece was supposed to flow, like water finding its path down a mountain. Her right hand picked up the melody, those haunting notes that had once made her professor cry during a lesson. Behind her, she heard Richard shift his weight. She could picture his face, that smug expression starting to crack just a little. He hadn't expected even this much. "Interesting choice," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "though it's quite a difficult piece. Perhaps you should try something simpler." His words were meant to shake her confidence, to make her stumble. For a moment, Her fingers hesitated. The melody wavered. "Let her play," a man's voice said firmly. She didn't recognize it. Maybe one of Richard's newer business partners. "Please continue." Natalie took a breath. The piece was building now, moving from those gentle opening notes into something more complex. Her left hand had to move across the keys, finding bass notes she couldn't see. The first jump missed. Her pinky landed one key too far. Someone coughed. Richard made a sound in his throat, half laugh, half sigh, but Natalie didn't stop. She adjusted, found the right key, and continued. And that's when something strange happened. The darkness that had been her enemy for 2 years suddenly became something else. Without the distraction of seeing the keys, of watching her hands, of reading music, all that existed was the sound, the feeling, the memory. Her body remembered this piece. Her arms knew how far to reach. Her fingers knew which keys came next, not because she could see them, but because they'd played this progression 1,000 times before. The music wasn't on a page or on the keys. It was inside her, had always been inside her. The piece grew more passionate, more intense. This was the part that used to make her nervous in recitals, watching the audience, worrying about their reactions. But now there was no audience to see, only the music to feel. Her right hand flew across the upper keys, the melody becoming almost frantic, desperate, like someone calling out in the night. Her left hand answered with deep, resonant chords that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory, from her soul, from the part of her that Richard's cruelty hadn't been able to touch. She heard a soft gasp from somewhere in the room. Someone whispered, "My God." The music was telling a story now. Her story. Those gentle opening notes had been her before, the perfect wife, the beautiful accessory, playing her role. But this middle section, wild and free and refusing to be, contained, this was her now. This was what had been sleeping inside her, waiting. Richard's presence behind her felt different now. The smugness was gone, replaced by something else. Confusion, anger, fear. She didn't care. For the first time in 2 years, she truly didn't care what he thought. Her fingers found a particularly difficult run, the kind that used to make her practice for hours. Without thinking, without hesitating, she played it perfectly. Then again, even better. The notes cascaded like falling stars, each one precise and purposeful. "How is she doing that?" Someone whispered. "Shh," another voice replied. The piece moved into its most emotional section. This was where Chopin had poured his homesickness for Poland, his longing for something lost. Natalie understood that longing now in a way she never had before. She'd lost her sight, yes, but she'd lost so much more. Her independence, her identity, her husband's love, though now, playing this piece, she wondered if she'd ever really had it at all. Had Richard ever loved her, or had he loved the idea of her? The beautiful, talented wife who'd given up her career for him, the perfect hostess, the living trophy. And when she'd become imperfect, broken in his eyes, that love had evaporated like morning mist. But the music had always loved. Her back. It didn't care if she could see. It didn't care if she was beautiful or perfect or whole. It only cared that she felt it, that she gave herself to it completely. Tears were rolling down her cheeks now, but her hands never faltered. If anything, they grew more confident. This was the section with the massive chords, the ones that required her hands to stretch to their absolute limit. She played them like thunder, like declarations of war, like proclamations of freedom. Someone in the room was crying. She could hear the soft, muffled sobs. Then she realized there were more. Several people were crying. The piece began to wind down, returning to echoes of that opening melody, but transformed now. If the beginning had been a question, this was the answer. Not a happy answer, necessarily, but a true one, a complete one. Her hands slowed, finding those final notes with a tenderness she hadn't known she still possessed. The last chord rang out, suspended in the air like a held breath. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Natalie's hands fell to her lap. She was shaking, her whole body trembling with the effort and emotion of what she'd just done. She waited for Richard to say something cutting, something cruel. Instead, she heard the sound of a single person clapping. Slow, deliberate claps that grew faster, louder. Then another joined, and another. Within seconds, the room erupted in applause. She heard chairs scraping as people stood up. Extraordinary, someone said. I've never heard it played with such feeling. Magnificent. But from Richard, nothing. She could feel him standing there, frozen, as his carefully orchestrated humiliation had transformed into her triumph. Excuse me? A woman's voice close to her now. Older, refined, with a slight accent Natalie couldn't place. My name is Victoria, Chen. I'm with the Philadelphia Symphony. That was one of the most moving performances I've heard in years. Natalie turned toward the voice, hardly able to process what she was hearing. I'm sorry, what? I'm a talent scout, Victoria continued. I came here tonight as a favor to my niece. She works at your husband's firm. I had no idea I'd be witnessing something like this. She's blind, Richard's voice cut in, sharp and dismissive. She can't perform professionally. Can't she? Victoria's tone was cool. I've just heard her play one of Chopin's most challenging pieces from memory, with more passion and technical skill than most sighted pianists I know. There are blind pianists performing all over the world, Mr. Thornton. Richard. His last name was Thornton, but everyone always called him by his first name, except when someone was putting him in his place. We should talk, Victoria said to Natalie, pressing something into her hand. A business card, raised letters she could feel. When you're ready. But please know, what you just did was remarkable. The way you played. It's like you found something in that piece that most people miss. The darkness in it. The light fighting through. Natalie's throat was too tight to speak. She nodded. This is ridiculous, Richard said, but his voice sounded different, smaller. Natalie, we should let her have this moment, another guest said firmly. A man's voice, one of Richard's business partners. Good God, Richard, your wife is brilliant. How did we not know this? Because he never told you, Natalie thought. Because he was ashamed of me. People were gathering around her now, voices mixing together in a chorus of praise and amazement. Someone touched her shoulder gently, asking if she'd studied professionally. Another wanted to know if she knew more Chopin. A woman said she'd been to concerts at Carnegie Hall that hadn't moved her this much. And through it all, Richard stood, silent. She could feel his rage, his humiliation, his complete loss of control over the situation. He'd wanted to display her weakness, and instead, she'd shown everyone her strength. He'd wanted to diminish her, and instead she'd eclipsed him entirely. Play something else, someone begged. Please. Natalie's hands were still shaking, but for the first time in 2 years, she felt alive. Truly, completely alive. She started, then stopped. She turned her head toward where she knew Richard was standing. What would you like to hear, darling? The word darling had never sounded less like an endearment. It was a challenge, a declaration of war. The same weapon he'd used against her, turned back on him. The room waited. Everyone wanted to see what Richard would do, what he would say. His perfect dinner party had become something else entirely, a moment of reckoning, a shifting of power, a revelation. And Natalie sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, no longer the broken bird he'd tried to display, but something else entirely, something he'd never expected, something unbreakable. Richard's silence stretched out like a taut wire. Natalie could hear his breathing, quick and shallow. She knew that sound. It was the same way he breathed when a business deal went wrong, when someone dared to challenge him in the boardroom. I think, he finally said, his voice carefully controlled. That's enough music for tonight. Our guests came for dinner, not a concert. Oh, but we'd love to hear more, the woman with the perfume said. And Natalie was surprised to hear genuine enthusiasm in her voice. Please, Just one more piece? Catherine's right. Another guest chimed in. This is extraordinary. When did you learn to play like this? Natalie turned slightly toward the voices. I started when I was 5. My mother cleaned houses, and one of her clients, Mrs. Garrett, had a piano. She let me play it while my mother worked. Eventually, she started teaching me. For free? Someone asked. In exchange for extra cleaning. My mother would stay late, scrub floors on her hands and knees so I could have lessons. Natalie's voice was soft, remembering. She said music would give me opportunities she never had. She felt the shift in the room. These wealthy people, they understood transactions, exchanges, sacrifices for success. But this was different from their world of bought privileges. And you gave it up? Victoria Chen asked gently. I fell in love, Natalie said simply. She didn't say with whom. She didn't need to. I thought I was choosing something better. A partnership. A life together. Richard made a sound. Half laugh, half scoff. You were hardly concert-ready back then, don't dramatize. Actually, Natalie said, her fingers finding the keys again, playing a soft, wandering melody. I had been accepted to Juilliard. Full scholarship. The room went silent again. She'd never told any of Richard's friends this. He'd always introduced her as his wife, formerly dabbling in music. The truth was so much bigger than that. You turned down Juilliard? Victoria's voice was incredulous. Richard said we couldn't have a real marriage if I was always traveling for performances, always practicing. He said he needed a wife, not a weekend visitor. The melody under her fingers grew darker, minor keys creeping in. I was 22. I thought being chosen by someone like him was worth more than choosing myself. Natalie. Richard's voice held a warning. Our guests don't need to hear. No, please continue. An older man interrupted. Natalie recognized his voice. Walter, something, one of Richard's most important clients. I think we're all learning a lot tonight. The melody shifted, became something else. A piece she'd written herself years ago before the accident. She'd never played it for anyone, not even Richard. Especially not Richard. After the accident, she continued playing softly. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. The other driver was texting, ran a red light. I woke up in darkness and they told me it would be permanent. Her left hand added harmony to the melody, deep and resonant. Richard was there every day at first. He held my hand, told me we'd get through it together. But when I came home, when reality set in, things changed. I couldn't host his parties anymore. I'd knock over wine glasses, bump into guests. I couldn't pick out the right dress or do my makeup the way he liked. I couldn't be the ornament he'd married. That's not, Richard started. Last month, Natalie interrupted, still playing. I heard you on the phone with your lawyer. You were asking about divorce procedures, about how to protect your assets if you left a disabled spouse. Gasps rippled through the room. The woman, Catherine, made a disgusted sound. But you stayed, Natalie continued, her music growing stronger. Not out of love, out of fear of how it would look. Richard Thornton abandoning his blind wife. What would the board think? What would the newspapers say? Stop. Richard's voice was ice. Stop playing, stop talking. But Natalie didn't stop. The music poured out of her, years of silence breaking like a dam. Do you know what the worst part was? She asked the room, though she was really asking Richard. It wasn't losing my sight. It was losing myself. Every day, you made me smaller. Every sigh when I needed help. Every moment of impatience when I moved too slowly. Every time you introduced me as your poor blind wife, you were erasing me piece by piece. The music reached a crescendo, both hands moving in perfect synchronization, creating a wall of sound that filled the room. But tonight, she said, having to raise her voice over her own playing, tonight you gave me a gift. You thought you were humiliating me, but you reminded me who I am, who I was before you decided I wasn't enough anymore. She stopped playing abruptly, the last notes hanging in the air like an accusation. I want a divorce, she said quietly. The silence was deafening. Then Walter cleared his throat. Richard, he said slowly, I think I've seen enough. That meeting Monday? We'll be going with another firm. What? Richard's voice cracked. Walter, you can't. I can and I will. I don't do business with men who treat people this way, especially not their wives, especially not someone with this kind of talent and courage. I'm withdrawing too, another voice said. One of Richard's other clients. This is unconscionable. You can't be serious, Richard sputtered. You're going to destroy my career over some emotional manipulation? She's playing victim, can't you see that? The only thing I see, Catherine said coldly, is a cruel man who tried to humiliate his disabled wife for entertainment, and a remarkable woman who refused to be humiliated. Victoria Chen stepped closer to the piano. Mrs. Thornton, Natalie, I meant what I said. The symphony has a program for featured soloists. The pay is substantial, more than enough to live independently. I can arrange an audition, though after what I've heard tonight, it's really just a formality. She's blind, Richard shouted, losing his composure entirely. She can't live alone, she needs me. No, Natalie said, standing up from the piano bench. I don't. I needed you to love me, to support me, to be my partner. But you couldn't do that once I wasn't perfect anymore. So now I need you to leave. This is my house. Actually, Natalie said, it's our house, community property, and I think you should sleep somewhere else tonight. Tomorrow we can start discussing how to divide things. Where would I even go? Maybe Catherine can help. You, Natalie said, and there was the tiniest smile in her voice. You two seemed very friendly at dinner. Catherine made a horrified sound. Absolutely not. Someone laughed, a short, shocked burst of sound, then another. The laughter spread, not cruel but cathartic, releasing the tension that had built up in the room. This is insane, Richard said. You're all insane. She plays one piece and suddenly, she played brilliantly. Victoria interrupted. She showed more courage and talent in 20 minutes than most people show in a lifetime, and she exposed you for exactly what you are. Natalie heard footsteps moving toward the door. Richard's business associates, his clients, his carefully cultivated network, they were leaving. But before they went, several stopped to speak to her. You're incredibly brave. That was the most beautiful music I've ever heard. Here's my card. My wife runs a foundation for disabled artists. Please call her. You deserve so much better. Each word was like a small light in her darkness, pushing back against 2 years of shadows Richard had cast over her life. Finally, only Richard, Victoria, and Natalie remained. She could hear Richard breathing hard like he'd run a marathon. His perfect evening, his perfect image, his perfect control, all shattered. You've ruined me, he said quietly. You've destroyed everything I've built. No, Natalie replied. You did that yourself. The moment you decided my blindness made me less than human. The moment you chose cruelty over compassion. She heard him move toward the door, his footsteps heavy. He stopped at the threshold. You'll regret this, he said. When you're alone, when you realize how hard the world is without me. The world is already hard, Natalie said. But at least now I'll be facing it as myself, not as the broken thing you wanted me to believe I was. The door slammed. The sound echoed through the house, final and absolute. Victoria touched her arm gently. Are you all right? Natalie took a deep breath. For the first time in 2 years, the air felt clean, felt free. I will be, she said. For the first time in a long time, I think I really will be. She turned back toward the piano, her fingers finding the keys one more time. This time she played something light, something hopeful. A melody that spoke of new beginnings, of doors opening, of a woman finding her way back to herself through music and darkness and unexpected strength. Victoria sat beside her on the bench listening, and in that moment Natalie realized that sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we needed to find what we actually deserve. 3 weeks had passed since the dinner party that changed everything. Natalie stood in the empty living room of her new apartment, listening to the echo of her footsteps on the hardwood floor. It was smaller than Richard's mansion, just 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a simple kitchen. But it was hers. "The piano will go here," Victoria said from somewhere, to her left. She'd been incredible these past weeks, helping Natalie not just with the symphony opportunity but with everything else too. "The movers are bringing it tomorrow." It was her mother's piano, the old upright that had been sitting in storage since her mother passed 5 years ago. Richard had called it an eyesore, refused to have it in his house. Now it was coming home. "Are you nervous about Thursday?" Victoria asked. Thursday. The audition. Even though Victoria had said it was just a formality, Natalie knew better. Though other board members hadn't heard her play. They only had Victoria's word, and in the classical music world that might not be enough. Not for a blind pianist nobody had heard of. Terrified, Natalie admitted, running her hand along the wall to map out her new space. What if that night was just adrenaline? What if I can't do it again? "You've been practicing at my studio every day. You can do it." That was true. Every morning, Victoria picked her up and drove her to a private studio where Natalie could practice for hours. Her fingers had remembered more than she'd thought possible. Pieces she'd learned as a teenager came flooding back. Even new pieces. Victoria would play them for her once, twice, and Natalie could pick them up by ear. Her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, holding it up. "Call from Richard," the voice assistant announced. "Decline," she said quickly. He'd been calling every day. First with anger, then with pleas, then with threats about the divorce settlement. But her lawyer, another gift from Walter, who'd felt terrible about not seeing Richard's true nature sooner, was handling everything. "He's still fighting the settlement?" Victoria asked. "He says I'm entitled to nothing because I contributed nothing to the marriage." Natalie laughed, but it was bitter. Apparently giving up Juilliard, giving up my career, supporting him through every business dinner, every social event, that counts as nothing. The judge won't see it that way. No, especially not with the recording. The recording. One of the dinner guests, it turned out, had recorded her performance on their phone. They'd sent it to her lawyer. Not just the music, but everything after. Richard's cruelty, her revelation about what she'd given up, his admission that he'd been considering divorce. It was all there. The doorbell rang, making Natalie jump. She still wasn't used to the sounds of this new place. "I'll get it," Victoria said. Natalie heard voices at the door, then footsteps approaching. More than one person. "Natalie?" A familiar voice, but one she hadn't heard in years. "It's Mrs. Garrett, her first piano teacher, the woman who'd taught her for free in exchange for her mother's extra cleaning." Natalie felt tears spring to her eyes. "How did you—" "I saw a video online," Mrs. Garrett said, and Natalie felt thin, elderly hands take hers. Someone posted it. "Blind woman shows up cruel husband with incredible piano performance. It's been viewed 2 million times." 2 million? Natalie couldn't process that. "You've gone viral, dear," Mrs. Garrett said. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I watched you play and I saw that little girl again. The one who would practice until her fingers hurt. The one who had more talent in her pinky finger than most people have in their whole body. I threw it away," Natalie said softly. "No, you made a choice. We all make choices. But the gift, that was always yours. Nobody could take that away. Not even Richard." They sat on the floor of the empty apartment, Natalie, Victoria, and Mrs. Garrett, and talked for hours. About music, about life, about second chances. Mrs. Garrett told her about other blind pianists who'd made careers, about new technologies that could help, about a whole world Natalie hadn't known existed. "Your mother would be so proud," Mrs. Garrett said before she left. "She always said you'd play on the big stages one day." That night, alone in her new apartment with just a mattress on the floor and a few boxes of belongings, Natalie couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from excitement. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The next few days flew by. The piano arrived and was tuned. She practiced until her neighbors gently complained. Then she practiced with the soft pedal down. She relearned the layout of her kitchen, burning a few meals but eventually managing a decent pasta. She took walks around the neighborhood with a white cane, counting steps, memorizing landmarks. "You're adapting remarkably fast," her mobility instructor said. She'd hired him with some of the money from the preliminary divorce settlement. Richard had been forced to provide temporary support. "I adapted to being small for 2 years," Natalie replied. "Adapting to being myself again is easier." Thursday arrived like a freight train, suddenly and with unstoppable force. Victoria drove her to the symphony hall. Natalie could tell it was big from the way sound echoed in the lobby. Her heels clicked on marble floors. "The board is in the main hall," Victoria said. "There are 5 of them. They're traditional, conservative. They might have concerns about a blind soloist. I know." They walked down what felt like an endless corridor, then through heavy doors into a space so vast Natalie could feel it in the way the air moved. "Miss Thornton," a man's voice called out, elderly and formal. "Please, approach the piano." The walk to the stage felt like miles. She counted steps, her cane tapping rhythmically, then up 3 stairs. Victoria had warned her about those. Finally, the bench. The piano was a Steinway. She could tell by the feel of the keys, the way they responded to the lightest touch. "What will you play for us?" the same voice asked. She'd prepared 3 pieces. But sitting there in that moment, she decided to play something else entirely. The piece she'd written herself, the one she'd played the night she'd asked for divorce. But this time she'd play all of it. "An original composition," she said. "It's called Learning to See in the Dark." A murmur from the board. Original compositions were risky for auditions. She began to play. The piece started in darkness. Low, stumbling notes like someone feeling their way through an unfamiliar room. Then gradually, patterns emerged. The left hand found a rhythm, steady and reliable. The right hand grew more confident, exploring higher octaves. The middle section was chaos. The accident, the hospital, the realization that the darkness was permanent. Discord and harmony fought for dominance. But then slowly something new emerged. Not light exactly, but understanding, acceptance, and finally, joy. The last movement was triumphant. It was every lesson she'd learned, every strength she'd found, every moment she'd chosen to keep going when giving up would have been easier. It was her mother's sacrifice, Mrs. Garrett's faith, Victoria's belief, and her own refusal to be diminished. When she finished, the hall was silent. She could hear her own heartbeat. Then a voice she didn't recognize, younger than the first. "That was extraordinary. You wrote that yourself?" "Yes." "When?" "Over the past 2 years, in my head. This is only the 2nd time I've played it all the way through." "In your head?" The elderly voice sounded incredulous. "You composed that entire piece without being able to write it down or play it?" "Music doesn't live on paper," Natalie said, echoing her first teacher. "It lives in here." She placed her hand over her heart. Another long silence. Then the sound of shuffling papers. "Miss Thornton," the elderly voice said, and now it was warm, almost grandfatherly. "We would be honored to have you as our featured soloist for the winter season. The position comes with a substantial salary, health insurance, and support staff to assist with any accommodations you need." Natalie's hands trembled on the keys. "We mean welcome to the Philadelphia Symphony. Your first performance will be in 6 weeks. Will that give you enough time to prepare?" 6 weeks. 6 weeks to prepare for the stage she'd dreamed of since she was 5 years old. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "More than enough." As Victoria drove her home, chattering excitedly about repertoire and rehearsal schedules, Natalie's phone buzzed. Richard again. This time she answered. "What do you want?" "I heard about the symphony," he said. His voice was different, smaller. "My connections told me. You got the position? Yes. A pause. Then, I was wrong. She waited, but he didn't elaborate. Wrong. About what specifically, she asked. Wrong to try to humiliate me? Wrong to treat me like I was broken? Wrong to make me believe I was worthless? You'll have to be more specific, Richard. You were wrong about so many things. All of it, he said quietly. I was wrong about all of it. Yes, she agreed. You were. She hung up. Victoria glanced over at her. You okay? Natalie smiled, a real smile, the kind she hadn't felt on her face in years. I'm better than okay, she said. I'm free. The Kimmel Center was alive with the sound of 3,000 people finding their seats. Natalie stood backstage, her hands steady now, though 6 weeks ago they'd been shaking with nerves during her first rehearsal with the orchestra. 5 minutes, the stage manager said softly beside her. She wore a deep blue gown that Victoria had helped her choose. It flows like water when you walk, Victoria had said, like your music. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style she could manage herself. No jewelry except small pearl earrings that had been her mother's. Your special guests are in the front row, the stage manager added. Just as you requested. Her special guests, Mrs. Garrett, now 83, who'd taken 3 buses to get here because she didn't trust anyone else to drive her. Walter and his wife, who'd become unexpected friends through all of this. Victoria, of course, though she'd be watching from the wings, and in the back, though Natalie hadn't invited him, she knew Richard was there. The divorce had been finalized last week and she'd gotten a text from his number. I'll be at your performance. Last row. I won't bother you. I just need to see this. She'd almost told security not to let him in. Then she realized it didn't matter anymore. His presence couldn't touch her, couldn't make her smaller. He was just another face in the crowd. Miss Thornton, the conductor, Michael Chen, Victoria's husband as it turned out, touched her elbow gently. Ready? She nodded. They'd worked together every day for 6 weeks. He'd learned to conduct in ways she could feel. The movement of air, the subtle vibrations through the stage. They'd developed their own language of music and trust. The orchestra was already on stage, warming up. She heard the cacophony slowly organize into individual sections, strings, woodwinds, brass. Then silence as Michael took his position. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice boomed through the hall. The Philadelphia Symphony is proud to present our featured soloist for this evening's performance. Making her debut with us, please welcome pianist Natalie Thornton. The applause was warm, but polite. They didn't know her yet. The viral video had gotten attention, but this was a Philadelphia high society. They waited to be impressed. The walk to the piano was 23 steps. She'd counted them dozens of times during rehearsals. Her hand found the curve of the Steinway. Her fingers traced its edge until she reached the bench. She sat, adjusted her position, and waited. The silence was complete. 3,000 people holding their breath. She'd chosen to open with Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was a risk, technically demanding, emotionally exhausting, and requiring perfect synchronization with the orchestra. But it was also a piece about resurrection, about climbing out of darkness. It felt right. Michael raised his baton. She couldn't see it, but she felt the orchestra's collective intake of breath. Then the strings began, that haunting opening that always made her think of rain on windows, of loneliness, of waiting. Her entrance came 8 measures later. The first chord rang out, powerful and clear. Her left hand found the bass notes that would anchor the piece, while her right hand began the melody that would wind through the entire first movement. The audience was absolutely still. She could feel their attention like heat from a fire. As she played, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. Not just the 6 weeks of preparation, not just the 2 years of darkness, but everything. Her mother's sacrificed hands, raw from cleaning so Natalie could have lessons. Mrs. Garrett staying late. teaching a poor girl who had nothing to offer but talent and determination. The scholarship to Juilliard she'd given up for what she thought was love. The music swelled, the orchestra joining her in a conversation that needed no words. Michael conducted with his whole body, and she felt every cue through the floor, through the air, through some invisible thread that connected all of them. The first movement ended with a flourish that left her breathless. No pause. Straight. Into the second movement, the one that always made her cry during rehearsals. It was about longing, about reaching for something just out of grasp. Her fingers found each note like old friends, like memories, like promises. Halfway through, she heard someone in the audience crying, soft sobs that tried to be quiet but couldn't quite manage it. She played for that person, whoever they were. She played for everyone who'd ever felt lost in the dark. The third movement was triumph. It was every mountain climbed, every fear faced, every moment of choosing to continue when stopping would be easier. The orchestra thundered behind her with her, lifting her, playing to heights she hadn't known she could reach. Her hands flew across the keys, no longer thinking, just feeling. This was what she'd been born to do. Not to be someone's wife, not to be perfect or beautiful or whole by anyone else's definition. But to do this, to take the emotions that lived too deep for words and give them sound. The final measures approached, like a wave building far out at sea. She could feel the orchestra preparing, the audience leaning forward. Everything built to that last, glorious chord that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Then silence. 1 heartbeat. 2, 3. The explosion of applause was like nothing she'd ever experienced. It wasn't polite anymore. People were on their feet. She could hear them standing, chair after chair after chair. The roar of approval washed over her like a physical force. She stood, bowed in the direction of the audience, turned to where she knew Michael was standing, bowed to him in the orchestra. The applause didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. "Bravo!" someone shouted. Then others picked it up. "Bravo! Bravo!" She felt Michael's hand on her elbow, guiding her forward for another bow. The applause went on and on. 5 minutes, 6, 7. Her face was wet with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. Finally, when the applause began to fade, she held up her hand. The hall fell silent immediately. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying without a microphone. This moment is for everyone who's ever been told they're not enough. For everyone who's had to find light in the darkness. And especially, she paused, steadying herself. For my mother, who believed in me before I believed in myself. She sat back down at the piano. The program called for an intermission now, but she had something else in mind. "I'd like to play one more piece," she said. "It's not on the program. It's something my first teacher, Mrs. Garrett, taught me when I was 6 years old. She's here tonight." She began to play Clair de Lune. Simple, beautiful, pure. The piece that had started everything. In the front row, she knew Mrs. Garrett was crying. Somewhere in the back, Richard was seeing who she really was for the first time. And scattered throughout the hall were 3,000 people who would remember this night, this moment, this woman who'd refused to let darkness define her. When she finished, the applause was softer but somehow deeper. She stood, bowed once more, and let Michael guide her off stage. Victoria was waiting in the wings, grabbed her in a fierce hug. "That was, I don't have words." "I know," Natalie said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I know." Later, after the reception, after the congratulations, after the offers for more performances that came flooding in, Natalie stood outside the stage door. The night air was cool on her face. "Natalie?" Richard's voice. She'd been expecting this. "Hello, Richard. I wanted to say, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. Thank you. I mean it. I sat there and I thought about all those years when you could have been doing this. All those years I kept you from this. I'll never forgive myself." She turned toward his voice. "I don't need you to. I don't need anything from you anymore, Richard. But I hope you learned something tonight. What's that? That when you try to diminish someone else's light, you only reveal your own darkness. She heard him walk away, his footsteps fading into the city sounds. Victoria appeared beside her, linking their arms. Ready to go home? Victoria asked. Home. Her little apartment with her mother's piano and her new life and her future spreading out before her like an endless symphony. Yes, she said. I'm ready. As they walked to the car, Natalie thought about the title of the piece she'd written, Learning to See in the Dark. She'd thought it was about blindness, about disability, about finding her way without sight. But now she understood it was about something more. It was about seeing herself clearly for the first time. About understanding that the darkness Richard had tried to impose on her had nothing to do with her eyes, and everything to do with his heart. About learning that sometimes we need to lose everything we thought mattered to find what actually does. The Cinder performance at the Kimmel Center was just the beginning. There would be other stages, other audiences, other triumphs. But this night, this moment of reclaiming herself through music, this was the one she'd remember forever. She'd spent 2 years in darkness. But tonight, finally, she was free. And in that freedom, she'd found something better than sight. She'd found herself.